A lot of times we as Americans have the most idealistic of intentions, and we fail to see the reality of what corruption will do to be recognized. The first thing to realize about corruption is that it is in a battle, an all-out battle, a cold, calculated battle for getting the upper hand. And corruption has a few characteristics. One of them is audacity, sheer audacity. And for those who are willing to stand on principle against corruption, they must realize that the audacity that it will go to, the extent that it will go to any extreme to gain the upper hand. And this is nowhere more true than America's history and American politics. We called him the American Lionheart. Andrew Jackson was a president of the United States in the mid-1800s. In 1816, the Second Bank of the United States was formed, and by the time Andrew Jackson won his presidency in 1832, he was in an all-out fight against the Second Bank of the United States. Andrew Jackson campaigned on a platform to destroy, to do battle, to do war against the Second Bank of the United States. And he had the American people behind him. We had experienced recessions and double-dip recessions many times before, and the American people said, we want none of it. We do not want a centrally controlled bank controlling the money supply for the entire nation. Andrew Jackson won on a promise to defeat the bank. At that time, the controller of the bank was a man named Nicholas Biddle, and Nicholas Biddle was shrewd. He was corrupt, and he was audacious. And he went after the president, and he went after the preservation of the bank at all costs, realizing that Andrew Jackson would be forming his coalition to do away with the bank. He preemptively struck and petitioned Congress for a re-charter of the 20-year charter on the Second Bank of the United States, 4 years before the charter was up for renewal. He gained the passage of that charter, but Andrew Jackson had anticipated the audacity of corruption. And Andrew Jackson moved to veto the bill that Congress had put forth and passed. Biddle had made a wager that the president would not risk his political career on something of this nature, and the president balked at it. Not only did he balk, but he went directly to the American people in what some consider to be one of the most passionate discourses and one of the most passionate State of the Union addresses ever given by an American president, laying out the constitutionality, or rather the unconstitutionality, of the Second Bank of the United States, the tyranny that it would put forth. The American people believed him, and they supported the president, but Nicholas Biddle would not be outdone. After all, corruption is audacious, and he found a way to go forward. Leveraging the power and the mechanisms that he had in place through the Second Bank of the United States, the influence that he had over large portions of the U.S. at the time, the Congress itself, the industrial complex, the media, so many of these things coming together, he leveraged them to preserve the bank at all costs. Well, President Jackson felt the war was not for giving in. And so he made a direct appeal to the American people, laying out his reasoning for why he would abolish the Second Bank of the United States. He won re-election and immediately moved to move all of the federal deposits that were currently being placed in the Second Bank into the state banks, and to pay for the expenses of the federal government out of the federal Second Bank. He felt if he could bleed the bank dry, then it would die of unnatural causes. Nicholas Biddle's next move in this cold and calculated battle of corruption was to move to contract the money supply nationally, to literally leverage and pawn the entire American population in a massive political war to preserve his bank. And so he contracted the money supply, and predictably, at a very critical moment, when easy lending had made the American people feel confident about borrowing, and so we were well overextended, he moved to contract the money supply, and predictably, unemployment skyrocketed. The cost of doing business went through the roof, and businesses began to fail. And the political pressure at the time, what Andrew Jackson called a phalanx of orators standing against him, rose to strike at Congress and strike at Jackson because Nicholas Biddle had conveniently and expertly crafted the national dialogue to insist that the president and Congress was responsible for this. If the president had not taken those deposits out of the federal bank, then we could have weathered this storm. Congress needed a scapegoat. And so they moved for the first time in American history to censure the president. And at this point in the darkest hour of Andrew Jackson's political career, despite his ironclad resolve, the American lion found himself caged against the will of corruption. Fortunately, corruption has several characteristics along with audacity. Corruption also operates from overweening pride, and Nicholas Biddle was no exception. He began to brag about his efforts to contract the money supply, his efforts to save the second bank of the United States at all costs. And the Pennsylvania governor at the time, George Wolfe, who was presiding over the state where the second bank was operating out of, denounced both the bank and Nicholas Biddle for their intentions. It was that confidence, it was that courage that mirrored the courage of the American lion that gave Congress resolve to look once again at the decision they had been made. And in a series of quick, instantaneous decisions over a very short period of time, they lifted the censure and they said, we must look in and audit the second bank of the United States. Congress committee showed up at the front door of Nicholas Biddle's office for the second bank with a subpoena order, which he turned down immediately. And it turns out you don't do that to Congress when they're holding a subpoena in their hands. He was immediately put in prison. And predictably, over the next few years, the charter, which Andrew Jackson had vetoed, became the end of the second bank of the United States, which was eventually converted into a state bank in Pennsylvania. The moral of this story is that one can only do battle against the cold-hearted nature of corruption when one is willing to understand in advance all of the attacks that may come at them throughout the process. Andrew Jackson was honest and courageous enough to see the attacks way off in a distance so that he was not thrown off balance during the process. America needs more men and women like this. America needs more American lions. Individuals who will understand that everything will be leveraged against them if they stand for what is right and what is true and what our framers intended in our country. Because corruption knows no limits. It cannot be dealt with. It cannot be negotiated with. Values that are contrary to our own must be defeated, not compromised with. And it will take a pack of American lions to bring it to its knees.